Today's parable seems to be a pretty easy story to understand. Luke sets things up for us by giving us a context for Jesus' story. He says that Jesus told this story to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. The Message says that Jesus told this story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance and looked down their noses at common people. With this introduction, the meaning of the parable seems quite clear. The Pharisee is the bad guy, proud of his accomplishments, looking down his nose at others, and the tax collector is the good guy, humble and searching for God's mercy. And this is further underscored by Luke's tag ending, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Again, turning to the Message, Luke's words are paraphrased creatively as follows. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself. Now that's a fine moral lesson, and nobody who's listening to this sermon would argue against it. However, it oversimplifies Jesus' parable, and in my opinion, it sucks the life out of it. It gives the listener a quick answer to a complex situation, and that is very uncharacteristic of Jesus' parables. And the reason why Jesus' stories are so compelling is that they give the listener something to chew on long after the story is told. And today's parable is no exception to this rule. And what we need to do in order to put the bite back in Jesus' story is to strip this parable from Luke's context and listen to it again through first century Jewish ears. When we do this, the parable comes alive. It offers us no easy answers and gives us something to chew on for days, weeks, or maybe even a lifetime. So let's get started. Our story begins not with Luke's introduction, but with the phrase, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And this is the way Jesus would have told the story. Without Luke's introduction, the hearer doesn't automatically think of the Pharisee as a negative caricature. In fact, the opposite is true. John Dominic Crossan, a well-known biblical scholar, suggested an intriguing modern equivalent to this parable. He begins by saying, a pope and a pimp went into St. Peter's to pray. So for this parable to work, the initial assumption for Jesus' audience would be that the Pharisee is the righteous person and the tax collector is not. And without this basic assumption, we do not have the unexpected role reversal, which is characteristic of a number of Jesus' parables, such as the Good Samaritan. And so, as the story begins, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. First century Jewish ears would hear several things in this opening statement. Number 1, the story takes place in the temple, and this context determines the rules of the game. It brings with it a specific set of rules and expectations about who is welcome and who is unwelcome, who is worthy or unworthy, who is an insider and who is an outsider. And because of this context, the Pharisee would be labeled as good and the tax collector would be labeled as bad. The Pharisee is the insider and the tax collector is the outsider. If they had gone to a Roman law court, their values and the parable's point of view would have been different. However, the temple context makes this a story in which the audience would clearly define the Pharisee as an upstanding citizen and the tax collector as questionable at best. And there is no other way that Jesus' audience would hear the opening line of this parable. And that's very different from our assumptions of this story. And this is further underscored by the next 3 verses which follow, where we hear the temple prayers of these 2 men. Verses 11 through 12 read, the Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. Now, we modern Christians hear this prayer as being pretty self-righteous. However, I believe first century Jewish ears would hear this prayer a little bit differently. First of all, the Pharisee stands by himself to pray. Standing is the normal posture for prayer in the temple, and there's nothing suspicious about this action. nor the detail that he was standing alone. As far as the content of his prayer goes, it's a form of a Jewish prayer of thanksgiving. A real-life example of this kind of prayer occurs in the Talmud, which is a collection of ancient rabbinic writings, which forms the basis of religious authority in Orthodox Judaism. And listen to this prayer and see if it doesn't sound similar to our gospel lesson. I give thanks to you, O Lord my God, that you have set my portion with those who sit in the house of study. Excuse me. And you have not set my portion with those who sit in the street corners. For I rise early, and they rise early. But I rise early for words of Torah, and they rise early for frivolous talk. I labor, and they labor, but I labor and receive a reward. And they labor and do not receive an award. I run, and they run, but I run to the life of the future world, and they run to the pit of destruction. Sound familiar? The structure of this prayer is similar to that of the Pharisees' prayer in our gospel lesson. The Talmud does not view that prayer as being self-righteous or boasting. The rabbi is simply giving God thanks that he has been so blessed as to be able to study the Torah. Therefore, the Pharisees' prayer in Jesus' parable would have been viewed as a standard prayer that any good pious Jew would pray in the temple. And this reinforces the belief that the Pharisee was a decent man, a pillar of society. And there is no way that Jesus' audience would see the Pharisee as a bad person or his attitude as being self-righteous. This is something that we place on the parable with our 21st century eyes. As the story continues, Jesus focuses attention on the tax collector. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Notice the tax collector's introduction parallels the Pharisees with the phrase standing by himself, replaced with standing far off. Both men are standing, the traditional prayer position, but the tax man stands far off in a corner, his eyes cast toward the ground. And we see this as a sign of humility. However, Jesus' audience would see this as a person who knew his place in the temple. Not that that's fair, it's just how it was. The tax person belonged to one of the groups of people that the Jews viewed as being outsiders. Tax collectors were considered to be supreme examples of what it meant to be a sinner. They contracted to collect a certain sum of money, and they made their own fortunes by collecting more than the sum that they agreed on to turn over to the authorities. Well, some Jewish writings consider tax collecting to be an occupation which leads a person to forfeit his status as one of the chosen people, as does swineherding in the parable of the prodigal son. Thus, it is a term with strongly negative social overtones in first century Hebrew society. According to this viewpoint, a person would have to give up his means of livelihood if he wished to reclaim his status as a pious Jew. Therefore, the tax collector would be seen as an outsider who knew his place in the temple. And this is further underscored by the tax collector's actions, as well as the content of his prayer. The parable tells us that the tax collector was beating his breast and saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Beating your breast is a symbolic sign of mourning and even despair, according to traditional Jewish piety. Furthermore, the tax collector's prayer is the form of a plea. God be merciful to me, a sinner. In a nutshell, Jesus' audience would hear that the tax collector is acknowledging his standing within the temple. He is a sinner. He's asking for forgiveness because of his occupation. Nothing is out of ordinary here. Everything is in its place. Wow, how different this is from our understanding of the parable. We modern-day Christians go into the story with a presumption that the Pharisee is bad and the tax man is good. And Jesus' first century Jewish audience would hear exactly the opposite. The Pharisee is good and the tax collector is bad. So without this first century understanding of the text, the punchline, the shocker of the story is gone. And we're simply left with a moral tale about the dangers of thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to. Now that's a fine message, but I think it robs the parable of its true power. Therefore, imagine yourself for a moment sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to this story. So far, everything is going as expected. Two men went up to the temple to pray, a pious Pharisee who gave thanks to God for his place in the world and his righteous way of living, and a tax collector who understood his place as an outsider, asking God to show mercy on his wayward life. Everything is as it should be. All the I's are dotted, every T is crossed, and then Jesus comes along with a punchline and says, "This tax collector, and not the other, went home made right with God." Whoa, wait a second, Jesus. What in the world are you talking about? That's not the way it works. This is what his first century audience would be thinking at this point. Pharisees are good, tax collectors are bad. Pharisees are on the inside, tax collectors are on the outside. It's really quite simple. We're all righteous and they're not. To which Jesus says, no, my children, it really isn't that simple. God's kingdom works in ways you've barely begun to understand. Sometimes the outside is on the inside, and the inside is on the outside. Get used to it, children, because it's going to drive you crazy. It's a whole new way of looking at the world around you. Now go talk about this story, chew on it for a while, and see how it speaks to you and challenges your life. Well, my dear friends, we've been chewing on this story for nearly 2,000 years. And after a surface reading of the text, we thought we understood the meaning of this parable. Those who think too highly of themselves are in danger of falling flat on their faces. But after seeing the parable through first century Jewish eyes, the meaning of the parable is not so clear anymore. It's more complex than we could have possibly imagined. To which I say, great. This parable, like all other parables, is meant to shake things up a bit. And if it doesn't shake us up this morning, then there's something wrong with the way we're hearing the parable. In a nutshell, I think Jesus is telling us that living life in the kingdom is not as black and white as it may seem. It's not about placing people in easily defined categories where everyone knows their place and acts accordingly. It's not about figuring out who is good and who is bad, who's on the inside and who's on the outside, and who is Jesus' little sunbeam and who is not. God's kingdom is much more complex than this, and if we cannot see ourselves as both the Pharisee and the tax collector, then I don't think we understand this parable at all. Truth be told, we are both the Pharisee and the tax collector simultaneously. We are a complex mixture of saint and sinner, good and bad, insider and outsider, and that, my friends, is good Lutheran theology. You see, we get into trouble when we become one over the other. We get into trouble when we use our sense of blessedness to make us feel morally superior over others. We get into trouble when we're so focused on our brokenness that we cannot see the grace God offers to all people who seek it. So this parable hits us in so many areas of our lives. And I'm not going to wrap it up in a neat little package because I believe that Jesus wants us to leave the parable open-ended so that we can go back to it again and again and see how it speaks to our lives. How are we like the Pharisees, placing labels on others, trying to separate the good from the bad, who is worthy of God's love and who is not? And how are we like the tax collector, feeling rejected and unwelcome by God's people, desperately seeking God's grace and mercy, and hearing the voice of Jesus saying, "Welcome, my child. You have found a home with me." These are questions worth pondering. Amen.